Imagine for a second that you're a federal investigator in November 1963. You've just been assigned the most important case in American history. The President of the United States has been shot dead in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses. Your job is simple: find the truth, follow the evidence, and tell the American people what really happened. But you're not going to do that. You aren't going to conduct a proper investigation. You aren't going to interview key witnesses properly. You're going to ignore evidence that doesn't fit the narrative. You're going to rush to conclusions. And when you're done, you're going to tell the country that a lone gunman with a cheap rifle pulled off one of the most remarkable shooting sequences in history, and that there's absolutely nothing to see here. Welcome to the Warren Commission, where the conclusion was written before the investigation even started, where over 60 years later, 65% of Americans still don't believe the official story, where the government has spent 6 decades keeping documents classified, releasing them piecemeal, always promising transparency while delivering redactions. Today we're going to walk through the most enduring conspiracy theory in American history, not because we're conspiracy theorists, but because the evidence demands it. We're going to look at how a nation that witnessed its president murdered in the streets was fed a story that never made sense, and how that cover-up continues to this very day. Buckle up. This one gets dark. And number 1, the magic bullet. When physics stops making sense. Let's start with what the government wants you to believe. On November 22, 1963, at 12:30 p.m. in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. He hit President Kennedy twice, killing him. He also hit Texas Governor John Connally. 1 bullet missed entirely. Case closed. Oswald acted alone. Except here's the problem. Oswald allegedly did this with a bolt-action Carcano rifle, a notoriously unreliable World War II surplus weapon that Italian soldiers called the humanitarian rifle because it was more likely to wound than kill. FBI marksmen tested the rifle for the Warren Commission and determined the minimum time between accurate shots was 2.25 seconds. That's the best-case scenario with expert marksmen who knew the shots were coming. The Zapruder film, analyzed frame by frame, shows Kennedy reacting to a hit somewhere between frames 210 and 225. Governor Connally was wounded no later than frame 240. The film ran at 18.3 frames per second. Do the math. That's roughly 1.5 seconds maximum between impacts. The rifle physically couldn't be fired that fast with accuracy. So the Warren Commission came up with a solution, the single bullet theory, later nicknamed the magic bullet. 1 bullet supposedly entered Kennedy's back, exited his throat without hitting his spine, changed direction in mid-air, entered Connally's back, exited his chest after shattering a rib, smashed through his right wrist, destroying the radius bone, and finally embedded itself in his left thigh. This bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, was found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital in nearly pristine condition. Almost no deformation, just a slight flattening at the base. You cannot make this stuff up. 1 bullet, 7 entry and exit wounds, 15 inches of tissue, 4 inches of shattered rib bone, a pulverized wrist. And the bullet looks like it was test-fired into ballistics gel. It's physically impossible, and everyone knew it. Governor Connally himself never believed the single bullet theory. His wife Nellie, who was sitting right next to him in the limousine, never believed it. She testified that she heard the first shot, turned and saw Kennedy clutching his throat, then heard a second distinct shot that hit her husband. 2 different shots, 2 different impacts. Not 1 magic bullet. Even President Lyndon Johnson, the man who created the Warren Commission, didn't believe it. In a recorded phone conversation with Senator Richard Russell in September 1964, Johnson admitted he didn't believe the single bullet theory. Russell, who was actually on the Warren Commission, told Johnson he couldn't sign off on it either. But they both did anyway. The final report was unanimous. Oswald acted alone. Move along, citizen. Number 2, the Oswald problem. The patsy who knew too much. Let's talk about Lee Harvey Oswald, because his life story reads like a bad spy novel. According to the official narrative, this is your assassin, a 24-year-old ex-Marine who scored sharpshooter in basic training, but was a marginal rifleman who defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, renounced his US citizenship, married a Russian woman, and then was allowed to return to America in 1962 with his Soviet bride and their child. No consequences. No interrogation. No nothing. Nothing? Think about that timeline. This is the height of the Cold War. The Bay of Pigs just happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis is brewing, and a former Marine who worked at a military radar installation in Japan defects to America's primary enemy, tries to renounce his citizenship, and the US government just lets him waltz back in. The State Department even loaned him money for the trip home. Then in September 1963, 2 months before the assassination, Oswald travels to Mexico City. He visits the Soviet embassy. He visits the Cuban embassy. According to CIA surveillance that was kept classified for decades, he meets with known KGB operatives. He tries to get a visa to Cuba. He's turned away. And the CIA is watching him the entire time. They have him on tape. They photograph everyone going in and out of those buildings. They know exactly who he's meeting with. And then, in October 1963, Oswald gets a job at the Texas School Book Depository. The building sits right on Dealey Plaza, directly along the route the presidential motorcade will take. What are the odds? The presidential visit to Dallas was only announced publicly in late September. The exact motorcade route was published in newspapers on November 19th, 3 days before the assassination, and Oswald just happens to work at the perfect vantage point. On November 22nd, Oswald is arrested less than 2 hours after Kennedy is shot. He's interrogated for 12 hours over 2 days by the Dallas police, the FBI, and the Secret Service. No recordings, no transcripts, no lawyer present. The Dallas police later claimed he confessed to nothing, denied everything, and requested legal representation that never arrived. What we do have is Oswald's impromptu press conference on the night of November 22nd. Reporters captured him saying, "I'm just a patsy." Then, 2 days later, while being transferred from city jail to county jail in front of a crowd of reporters and live television cameras, Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby shot him dead. Oswald never stood trial. He never testified. He never explained who the patsy remark referred to. Convenient. The documents released in 2025 revealed just how extensively the CIA was tracking Oswald in Mexico City. They had detailed surveillance logs, wiretap recordings, photographic evidence of his meetings. They knew he was in contact with Soviet intelligence officers, and they told the Warren Commission almost none of this. Either Oswald was the luckiest lone wolf in history, or someone was watching him very, very closely. Number 3. The Warren Commission. A conclusion in search of evidence. 7 days after Kennedy was murdered, President Lyndon Johnson issued Executive Order 11129, creating the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. Chief Justice Earl Warren agreed to lead it. The commission included 2 senators, 2 congressmen, former CIA Director Allen Dulles, and former World Bank President John McCloy. These were serious people. The public wanted answers. Over the next 10 months, the commission interviewed 552 witnesses, reviewed thousands of FBI reports, and visited Dallas multiple times. In September 1964, they released an 888-page report. Their conclusion: Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. No conspiracy, foreign or domestic. Case closed. Sounds thorough, right? Except here's what we know now. The commission didn't actually investigate. They structured their inquiry around 6 predetermined areas of focus, and 5 of them were about Oswald's background, motivations, and history. Only 11% of the final report dealt with the actual facts of the assassination itself. They assumed guilt and worked backward to justify it. Commission member Richard Russell, a U.S. senator from Georgia, later admitted he never believed the findings. In 1970, he told the Washington Post that Kennedy had been the victim of a conspiracy, and that the commission wasn't told the truth about Oswald. Another commission member, Senator John Sherman Cooper, called the ballistic findings unconvincing, but when Russell tried to include a footnote expressing his dissent in the official report, Earl Warren refused to allow it. Here's where it gets worse. The CIA and FBI systematically withheld information from the Warren Commission. We know this because it's now documented in their own internal reports. The CIA never told the commission that they had been running assassination plots against Fidel Castro involving the mafia. They never fully disclosed the extent of their surveillance on Oswald in Mexico City. They never mentioned that Oswald had been on their radar for years. A 2013 CIA internal report, finally released decades later, admitted that CIA officers were specifically instructed to provide only passive, reactive, and selective assistance to the Warren Commission. The agency's stated goal was to keep the commission focused on what the CIA believed was the best truth rather than the actual truth. Let that sink in. The intelligence agency investigating a presidential assassination decided to manage the narrative rather than reveal what they knew. The FBI was no better. J. Edgar Hoover sent President Johnson a preliminary report within 24 hours of the killing, naming Oswald as the sole culprit before any serious investigation had even begun. The FBI then fed the Warren Commission only information that supported this predetermined conclusion. Evidence that contradicted the lone gunman theory was buried, ignored, or explained away. This wasn't an investigation. It was a cover-up, and the commission members knew it. We're about halfway through, and if you're thinking this sounds insane, you're not alone. As of 2023, 65% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy to kill JFK. That's not fringe thinking. That's the majority. If you want to understand how governments manipulate public perception and why transparency is a myth, hit that subscribe button. Unlike the Warren Commission, this channel follows the evidence. Drop a comment. Lone gunman or conspiracy? I read every one. Number 4. The House Select Committee. Oops, we found a conspiracy. Fast forward to 1976. Public trust in the Warren Commission had utterly collapsed. A Detroit News poll that year showed 87% of Americans did not believe Oswald acted alone. The Watergate scandal had revealed how deeply the government was willing to lie. People wanted another look. Congress created the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They spent 2 years reinvestigating both the JFK assassination and the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination. They had access to technology and forensic methods the Warren Commission didn't have. They could review newly declassified documents. And in March 1979, they issued a bombshell conclusion. President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. Let me repeat that. The US government, after insisting for 15 years that there was no conspiracy, officially admitted there probably was one. The HSCA found a high probability that 2 gunmen fired at President Kennedy. They concluded there were 4 shots, not 3, and that at least one came from the grassy knoll to the president's right front. The acoustic evidence showed a 95% chance of a second shooter. This should have been the biggest news story of the decade. The government just admitted they got it wrong. But here's the problem. The committee couldn't identify the second gunman. They couldn't determine the extent of the conspiracy, and they didn't have the authority to bring criminal charges because everyone involved was either dead or untouchable. Then it got worse. In 1982, the National Academy of Sciences reviewed the HSCA's acoustic evidence and determined it was seriously flawed. They claimed the sounds on the police dictabelt recording that supposedly proved a second shooter were actually recorded after Kennedy had already been shot. The 95% probability evaporated. The conspiracy finding was walked back. The Justice Department declined to reopen the investigation. So we're back to square one, right? Not quite. Not because even though the acoustic evidence was disputed, the HSCA made several findings that still stand. They determined the Warren Commission's investigation was seriously inadequate. They found that the FBI and CIA had withheld critical information. They concluded that organized crime figures, specifically Carlos Marcello and Santo Traficante, had the motive, means, and opportunity to assassinate Kennedy. They found that anti-Castro Cuban groups also had motive, means, and opportunity. The HSCA basically said, "We can't prove who did it, but we know the official story is wrong, and we know multiple groups had reason to want Kennedy dead." Then they closed up shop and went home. No arrests. No accountability. Just an admission that yeah, something fishy happened, but good luck ever finding out what. Number 5. The documents. 6 decades of trust us. In 1992, Oliver Stone's film JFK reignited public obsession with the assassination. Congress responded by passing the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. The law was simple. All government records related to the assassination must be released by October 2017. No exceptions. Full transparency. The public deserves the truth. October 2017 arrived. President Donald Trump released some documents. He held back thousands more, citing national security concerns. The CIA, FBI, and State Department all argued that releasing certain information would harm intelligence operations and foreign relations. Trump gave them extensions. President Joe Biden did the same in 2021, 2022, and 2023. Each time the deadline approached, federal agencies requested more time to review records. By June 2023, Biden's press secretary announced that 99% of the assassination records had been released. But that remaining 1%? Still classified. Over 4,600 documents, either fully withheld or heavily redacted. Then in January 2025, President Trump signed an executive order directing the full release of all remaining JFK assassination records. Within days, approximately 80,000 pages were declassified and posted online with no redactions. After 61 years, the American people finally had access to everything, except it didn't change anything. Researchers pored over the newly released documents and found more details about CIA surveillance techniques, wiretaps in Mexico City, and the extent to which Oswald was being monitored. But there was no smoking gun, no memo that said we orchestrated the assassination, just more evidence of an intelligence apparatus that lied, manipulated, and covered up their incompetence. Here's the question nobody in government wants to answer. If these documents don't prove a conspiracy, why were they kept secret for 6 decades? What was so dangerous about revealing CIA wiretap methods from 1963? The answer is simple. The documents don't prove a conspiracy in the assassination itself. They prove a conspiracy to mislead the public about what the government knew, when they knew it, and how badly they botched the investigation. Number 6. The Cuban connection. Blowback is a bitch. One of the most plausible conspiracy theories involves Cuba, and it's not hard to see why. In April 1961, President Kennedy authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion, a catastrophic CIA operation to overthrow Fidel Castro. It failed spectacularly. Kennedy was humiliated. Castro survived, but the CIA didn't give up. They launched Operation Mongoose, a covert program to destabilize and ultimately assassinate Castro. The plots were bizarre and desperate: poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, a contaminated diving suit, even recruiting mafia hitmen. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented history, declassified decades later. Castro knew about the plots. He said so publicly. In September 1963, he warned in an interview that US leaders who plot assassinations against foreign leaders are themselves at risk. 6 weeks later, Kennedy was dead. And here's where it gets interesting. In September 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald traveled to Mexico City and visited the Cuban embassy. He tried to obtain a visa to travel to Cuba. He was turned away. The CIA was monitoring the embassy. They photographed everyone entering and leaving. They wiretapped the phones. They knew Oswald was there. Newly released documents show the extent of this surveillance. So, the CIA had detailed logs of Oswald's visits, recordings of phone calls, and evidence he met with Cuban consular officials who had known ties to Cuban intelligence. Why didn't they tell the Warren Commission all of this? The House Select Committee couldn't rule out Cuban involvement. They found that anti-Castro Cuban exile groups, enraged by Kennedy's refusal to fully support their cause after the Bay of Pigs, had both motive and capability, but they couldn't prove it. Here's the darkest irony. In a 1975 deposition, CIA Director Richard Johnson thought Kennedy's own foreign policy had gotten him killed. The circle of violence was complete. Number 7. The mob hit. When Ruby silenced the patsy. The mafia theory is straightforward and compelling. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, was waging all-out war on organized crime. He targeted the Teamsters Union, indicted mafia bosses Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, and went after Sam Giancana in Chicago. These men were not used to losing. Then there's Jack Ruby. The man who killed Oswald had deep connections to organized crime. He ran strip clubs in Dallas. He knew mobsters. He owed money to the mob. And on November 24, 1963, he walked into Dallas Police Headquarters, slipped past security during a staged prisoner transfer, and shot Oswald in the stomach on live television, ensuring the alleged assassin would never testify. Ruby claimed he acted spontaneously out of grief for Jackie Kennedy, to spare her the agony of a trial. But Ruby's own statements suggest something darker. At a 1965 press conference, Ruby said, "The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people who had so much to gain, and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in the position I'm in, will never let the true facts come above board." Who were the people? He never said. He requested to be taken to Washington to testify before the Warren Commission in safety. The request was denied. Ruby died of cancer in January 1967, still in prison, still claiming he knew more than he'd ever be allowed to say. The House Select Committee investigated the mafia connection extensively. They concluded that the National Syndicate of Organized Crime as a group was not involved. But they couldn't rule out individuals. Marcello and Trafficante both had means, motive, opportunity, and a history of violence. They had connections to Ruby. They had reason to hate the Kennedys. The pieces fit. But without Oswald alive to testify, without Ruby willing to talk, the mob theory remains circumstantial, compelling, logical, but unprovable. Number 8. The CIA. Lying then, lying now. The CIA theory is the most explosive and the one the government has fought hardest to suppress. Not that rogue agents pulled the trigger, but that the agency covered up what they knew and manipulated the investigation. After the Bay of Pigs disaster, Kennedy reportedly said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He fired CIA Director Allen Dulles. He stripped the agency of some covert action authorities. The CIA, particularly its old guard, hated him. Then Kennedy was killed, and the CIA had a problem. If the Warren Commission investigated too deeply, they might uncover the Castro assassination plots, the mafia connections, the illegal domestic surveillance. So the CIA lied. A 2013 CIA internal report admitted the agency withheld information from the Warren Commission. They didn't disclose the full extent of Oswald's contacts in Mexico City. They didn't mention the Castro plots. They actively managed what investigators were allowed to see, guiding them toward the best truth instead of the whole truth. Former CIA Director Allen Dulles, the man Kennedy had fired, sat on the Warren Commission. Think about that. The head of the agency most likely to have information about Oswald was on the panel investigating the assassination. The conflict of interest is staggering. The 2025 document release revealed more details about CIA surveillance methods, wiretapping techniques, and intelligence sources in Mexico City. But it didn't include a smoking gun memo saying, "We did it." What it showed was an agency obsessed with secrecy, willing to lie to Congress, willing to obstruct justice, willing to do anything to protect their operations. Did CIA officers kill Kennedy? There's no direct evidence. But we know they had motive. We know they had capability. We know they lied for 60 years. And we know that even today, after supposedly full disclosure, questions remain. Number 9. The real conspiracy. Killing trust in government. Here's what the JFK assassination really killed: trust in government. Before November 22, 1963, Americans largely believed what their leaders told them. After Dallas, that faith collapsed and never recovered. The numbers tell the story. In 1964, when the Warren Commission issued its report, 52% of Americans believed the lone gunman theory. By 1976, that number had plummeted to 19%. In 2023, 60 years after the assassination, 65% of Americans believe Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy. That's not a fringe position. That's a national consensus. Why? Because the government's story never made sense. Because key witnesses died under suspicious circumstances. Because documents were classified for decades. Because every investigation reached a different conclusion. Because the people running the investigations had conflicts of interest. Because the agencies that should have protected Kennedy were the same ones investigating his death. The JFK assassination became the template for every government cover-up that followed. Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers. Watergate and Nixon's crimes. Iran-Contra and Reagan's lies. Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction. Each time the government lied and got away with it, they learned they could do it again. When the 2025 documents were finally released, researchers immediately noted what was still missing: the Mary Ferrell Foundation, which maintains a comprehensive database of JFK assassination records, called the release Half a Loaf. Key files are still unaccounted for. Redactions remain unexplained. After 61 years, the JFK assassination has taught Americans a simple lesson. When the government promises transparency, expect redactions. When they claim national security, assume cover-up. When they say trust us, remember Dallas. Final thoughts. So was JFK killed by a lone gunman, or was it a conspiracy? The honest answer is, we may never know for certain. Oswald is dead. Ruby is dead. The key witnesses are gone. The documents are finally public, but they don't provide a smoking gun. What we do know is this: the official story is riddled with holes. The single bullet theory is physically implausible. The Warren Commission was a whitewash designed to calm public panic rather than find truth. The CIA lied systematically. The FBI lied systematically. And for 60 years, the government fought to keep documents classified not because they proved a conspiracy to kill the president, but because they proved a conspiracy to deceive the public. Think about what that means. And for 6 decades, multiple administrations, Democrat and Republican, maintained the classification of documents that ultimately revealed nothing more shocking than government incompetence and institutional lying. They kept secrets not to protect national security, but to protect their own credibility. The real conspiracy wasn't shadowy figures on the grassy knoll. It was the institutional decision made in the days after Dallas that the American people couldn't handle the truth, that maintaining stability required manufacturing a neat narrative, even if that narrative was false. That closure mattered more than honesty. They were wrong. The lack of honesty didn't provide closure. It created a wound that has never healed. It taught Americans that their government lies as a matter of policy. It destroyed trust that has never been rebuilt. 60 years later, November 22nd, 1963, remains an open wound in American democracy. Not because we don't know what happened, but because we know we were lied to about it. And that lie, more than any bullet, killed something essential: the belief that our government works for us and tells us the truth. If you want to understand how power really works, how institutions protect themselves, and why transparency is always a lie, subscribe to this channel. Next video, we're diving into the CIA's overthrow of foreign governments during the Cold War. Spoiler alert, Dallas was just practice. See you in the next one.